There are moments in life when everything you've built collapses in silence. The plans, the identity, the certainty. You watch them crumble like dust slipping through your fingers. You stand in the ruins of what once felt unshakable, asking yourself a question that echoes louder than the noise around you: who am I now? That question is not a cry of defeat. It is the beginning of transformation. Because it is only when the old structures fall that we are invited to build something real, something rooted not in illusion but in truth. Most people fear that breaking point, yet it is the most sacred moment a human being can experience. It is the doorway between what you were and what you are meant to become. The world will tell you to move on, to rebuild quickly, to forget the pain. But true rebuilding does not begin with denial. It begins with awareness. It begins with the courage to look into your own shadow, to meet the parts of yourself you've hidden, and to ask not how do I get back to who I was, but how do I become who I truly am. That is the real meaning of rebuilding yourself. There comes a time in every person's life when the mirror of existence no longer reflects the image they wish to see. The face that looks back seems fragmented, uncertain, burdened with unspoken memories and unhealed wounds. In that quiet discomfort begins the process of rebuilding oneself, not through achievement or external change, but through descent. To rebuild, one must first fall into the shadow, into the depths of one's own unconscious, where truth hides behind fear and darkness conceals the seeds of light. The shadow is not evil, though it may appear terrifying. It is the collection of everything we have refused to acknowledge about ourselves, the anger we suppress, the envy we deny, the weakness we conceal under confidence. It is the forgotten part of our nature that we have pushed away to remain acceptable to others and to ourselves. Yet every act of repression builds pressure within the psyche, and sooner or later, that buried energy demands recognition. The shadow waits patiently, manifesting in the cracks of our relationships, the patterns of our failures, and the unexplained heaviness that settles over our days. To rebuild oneself, one must have the courage to meet this shadow face to face. This descent is not a glamorous journey. It is raw, unsettling, and often lonely. It demands that we let go of illusions, the comfortable stories we tell ourselves about who we are. It requires us to walk through the corridors of our inner fears without armor, to witness the chaos that lives beneath our controlled surfaces. Many avoid this path, preferring distraction or denial, but what is avoided does not disappear. It festers and governs from the depths. The person who dares to turn inward begins to reclaim the lost fragments of their soul. When we confront the shadow, we uncover not only darkness but also vitality. Hidden beneath our fears are passions that were never lived. Beneath our resentment lies the cry for recognition. Beneath our guilt often hides a desire for freedom. The shadow carries the very energy we need for transformation, but only if we integrate it consciously. This means neither rejecting it nor surrendering to it, but understanding it, accepting it as part of ourselves, and allowing it to enrich our being. To rebuild oneself is not to erase the past, but to weave it into a more complete picture of the self. Each encounter with the shadow is a dialogue with truth. It reveals where we have betrayed ourselves for approval, where we have chosen comfort over authenticity. It shows us that our greatest enemies are not others, but the unacknowledged parts of our own nature. Anger, jealousy, and pride, when seen clearly, become guides rather than destroyers. They point toward unmet needs, forgotten values, or unexpressed strengths. The task is not to suppress these emotions, but to listen to what they are trying to tell us. In this listening, the fragments begin to reassemble into a living whole. The descent also teaches humility. It strips away the false idea that we are in complete control of our lives or immune to contradiction. It reveals the paradox of the human condition, that within every strength lies a weakness, and within every flaw a hidden virtue. Only through this awareness can we develop true compassion, both for ourselves and for others. Compassion arises when we realize that every human being wrestles with their own shadows, that behind every smile there are unseen struggles. Rebuilding through descent is not a one-time act, it is a lifelong process of inner excavation. It calls for patience and honesty. Some days the light will pierce through, illuminating hidden beauty. Other days, the darkness will seem endless. Yet even in the darkest moments, something sacred stirs, a quiet knowing that the journey itself is the transformation. The shadow is not an obstacle to overcome, but a teacher to understand. It leads us toward integration, toward authenticity, toward a life not split between who we are and who we pretend to be. To face one's shadow is to reclaim one's power. Every part of the self that was once rejected returns as a source of strength and wisdom. What was once chaos becomes coherence. What was once pain becomes meaning. Through descent, the old self dissolves, making space for something more real to emerge. The act of rebuilding begins not with construction, but with surrender. Surrender to truth, to vulnerability, to the vast and often uncomfortable depth of our own humanity. And in that depth, quietly waiting beneath all the fear and fragmentation, lies the foundation of the new self, the self that is whole. ChatGPT said, to rebuild oneself, the first walls that must crumble are those built from illusion. Most people live within a structure not of their own making, a self carefully assembled to satisfy the expectations of others. From early life, we learn to wear masks: the obedient child, the ambitious worker, the likable friend, the strong one who never shows pain. These masks are not false in a malicious sense. They are survival tools, identities we create to belong, to be loved, to avoid rejection. Yet over time, they begin to suffocate the living essence beneath them. What begins as protection becomes imprisonment. The greatest tragedy is that we start to believe the mask is who we truly are. This false self feeds on approval. It thrives in comparison, always measuring its worth against external standards: beauty, success, wealth, intellect, or power. It fears judgment and rejection more than emptiness, and so it becomes an actor in its own life, performing roles written by society, family, or culture. The performance may be convincing, but deep within there is restlessness, a quiet ache that whispers, "This is not me." That whisper is the beginning of awakening. It is the call to break the mask and rediscover the original face beneath it. The authentic self that existed before the world told us who we should be. The breaking of the false self is not an act of destruction for its own sake. It is an act of liberation. Yet liberation rarely comes gently. The moment one begins to question their identity, the mask resists. Fear arises, for the mask has been worn so long that its removal feels like death. The ego clings to what is familiar, even if that familiarity is painful. To let go of pretense is to step into uncertainty, to face the question, if I am not what I've pretended to be, then who am I? That question is both terrifying and sacred. It opens the door to the true work of rebuilding. The process requires honesty that cuts through comfort. It asks us to examine every motive, every ambition, every attachment, and to ask whether it arises from truth or from fear. Do we pursue certain goals because they express our inner calling, or because they promise validation? Do we maintain relationships out of love, or out of a fear of being alone? These questions expose the threads that weave the false self together. Pulling them apart is painful, because it unravels not only the illusion, but the identity that sustained us. But in that unraveling lies clarity. When the mask begins to fall, life may appear to collapse. The structures that once gave us a sense of stability, career, status, roles, might lose their meaning. The people who were drawn to our mask may drift away. Even our dreams may dissolve into silence. This is the void between the old self and the emerging one. It is not emptiness to be feared, but a necessary clearing, a sacred pause where the soil of the soul can be made fertile again. What feels like loss is in truth purification, the burning away of all that is not authentic. The authentic self is not a fixed identity, but a living presence. It does not need to prove itself, because its worth is inherent. It acts not from compulsion, but from alignment. To live authentically is to act in accordance with one's inner truth, even when that truth contradicts collective norms. It is to speak when silence would be easier, to stand firm when conformity would bring comfort. Such integrity cannot coexist with the mask, for the mask thrives on pretense while authenticity thrives on truth. The more one listens inwardly, the less the opinions of others dictate one's direction. This breaking of the false self also transforms how we relate to others. When we no longer hide behind the mask, our connections become deeper, freer, and more honest. The need to impress fades, and genuine understanding takes its place. Vulnerability, once feared, becomes a source of strength. The world, once viewed as a stage, becomes a mirror reflecting our inner state. In that mirror, we see not only ourselves but the shared humanity of others who too struggle with their own illusions. Compassion grows naturally when we recognize that everyone is trying to remember who they truly are. Rebuilding after the fall of the false self is not about constructing a new persona, but uncovering what has always been present, the unconditioned core of being. The more we shed what is inauthentic, the more space there is for truth to breathe. What emerges is quieter, humbler, but infinitely more powerful. The self rebuilt from truth does not need validation, for it draws its strength from inner coherence. To break the mask is to reclaim one's freedom, to live not as an image but as a soul. And though the process may shatter every illusion we once held, it is through that very shattering that we finally become whole. There comes a stage in the process of rebuilding when silence becomes more instructive than speech, when the outer noise of ambition, failure, and identity no longer holds meaning. It is in this stillness that one begins to hear the quiet murmur of something deeper, the voice of the soul. Most people live far from this voice. They move through the world guided by the mind's chatter, by logic, by what seems practical or acceptable. But beneath that surface current, there is another language, one that does not speak in words, but in symbols, feelings, and subtle intuitions. To rebuild oneself is to learn that language again, to enter into dialogue with the soul that has waited patiently beneath the surface of thought. This dialogue cannot be forced. It does not respond to willpower or control, for the soul does not dwell in the realm of the intellect. It communicates through dreams, through the sudden appearance of an image, through an emotion that seems disproportionate to the moment, through a quiet knowing that cannot be explained. When we begin to pay attention to these signals, we realize that the soul has been speaking all along, but we have been too distracted to listen. Modern life rewards noise, constant motion, endless consumption, relentless analysis. The inner voice, soft and subtle, becomes drowned beneath this turbulence. The rebuilding begins the moment we turn inward and allow silence to settle like dust after a storm. Listening to the soul often feels like remembering something long forgotten. There is familiarity in it, as if you are returning to a home you once knew but lost. Yet it also confronts you with truths that the surface self resists. The soul speaks honestly. It reminds you of what you have abandoned, the dreams you betrayed, the emotions you buried to appear strong. It calls you not toward comfort, but toward authenticity. Sometimes its guidance disrupts the life you have carefully constructed, urging you to leave behind what no longer nourishes your spirit. The rational mind protests, but the soul does not bargain. It whispers, and its whisper carries the weight of necessity. To truly rebuild oneself, one must allow this dialogue to transform decision-making. Instead of chasing what others define as success, you begin to sense what feels alive within you. Choices become less about outcome and more about alignment. You start to trust the quiet pull that draws you towards certain people, paths, or places. The soul does not rush, it moves in rhythm with what is natural. In following it, you may appear irrational to the world, but internally, you begin to feel a profound coherence, as if life itself is guiding you from within rather than pushing you from without. This conversation with the soul also deepens one's relationship with suffering. Pain is no longer seen merely as punishment or misfortune, but as communication, a signal that something essential is being ignored or denied. When we listen deeply to our pain, it often reveals the soul's unmet longing. Perhaps the sorrow that lingers is not about loss alone, but about the parts of ourselves we have abandoned in the pursuit of security or recognition. By bringing awareness to that pain without judgment, we begin to translate it into meaning. The soul uses suffering not to destroy us, but to awaken us. Dreams, too, become sacred messages in this dialogue. The images that rise in sleep are not random illusions, but symbolic reflections of the inner landscape. They show us what the conscious mind cannot grasp. A dream of falling may reveal the fear of surrender. A recurring image of a locked door may signify the self's resistance to transformation. When we take the time to reflect on these symbols, to let them unfold in feeling rather than explanation, we discover that the soul has its own form of wisdom, one that is older and more intimate than logic. As this relationship with the inner voice deepens, the boundaries between the inner and outer world begin to blur. You start to see signs everywhere, patterns, coincidences, encounters that seem orchestrated. Life begins to mirror your inner state. The soul does not speak only in isolation. It also communicates through the world itself, arranging events and encounters to guide you toward greater awareness. Rebuilding through the soul's guidance means understanding that existence is not random but participatory. You are not merely reacting to life, you are in conversation with it. In this dialogue, trust becomes the foundation. The mind demands proof, but the soul asks for faith, not blind belief, but the willingness to listen without immediate understanding. There are times when the soul will lead you into uncertainty, stripping away the familiar so that you can rediscover what is essential. It may feel like loss, but what is being taken are only the false attachments that once defined you. When you yield to that process, you begin to live from an inner rhythm that cannot be dictated by fear or social expectation. To rebuild oneself through the guidance of the soul is to live from the inside out. It is to honor intuition as much as reason, silence as much as speech, being as much as doing. It is to rediscover that the truest compass is not external validation, but the quiet resonance of truth within the heart. Through this dialogue, life ceases to be a series of disconnected events and becomes a living conversation between who you are and who you are meant to become. ChatGPT said, "Rebuilding oneself is not a process of choosing one side of our nature over the other, but of learning to hold both." Within every person, there exists a tension between opposites, light and dark, strength and tenderness, logic and emotion, desire and restraint, chaos and order. Most of our suffering arises not because these opposites exist, but because we try to deny one half of them. We cling to what we believe is good or acceptable and reject the rest as unworthy. We want to be strong without ever feeling weak, wise without ever admitting ignorance, peaceful without ever confronting conflict. But by doing so, we divide the self against itself. The human spirit fractures when it seeks perfection instead of wholeness. Rebuilding begins the moment we stop striving to be pure and begin striving to be complete. The integration of opposites is the quiet art of inner reconciliation. It demands that we stop labeling parts of ourselves as enemies. The anger we condemn, the fear we suppress, the sadness we hide, each carries truth and energy that belong to our total being. When we deny them, they do not vanish, they sink into the unconscious, shaping our behavior in ways we no longer control. A person who refuses to face their anger may become passive-aggressive, One who denies their vulnerability may grow brittle and proud. Integration begins with acknowledgement, to look at each emotion and impulse not as a flaw, but as a message from the psyche seeking balance. Only through acceptance can transformation occur. The mind prefers clarity and order, but the soul thrives on paradox. It knows that joy and sorrow, love and loss, creation and destruction are intertwined. To rebuild the self, we must become capable of holding contradictions without collapsing into confusion. This means recognizing that what we call weakness may carry its own form of strength. Tears, for instance, are not evidence of defeat, but expressions of feeling too deep for silence. Similarly, rage can point to a boundary violated or a truth suppressed. Each emotion, no matter how dark, has a purpose when seen through the lens of understanding. Integration is not indulgence. It is awareness. It is learning to sit beside one's chaos long enough to hear what it wants to say. As one begins to accept these inner polarities, life itself becomes more expansive, the need for rigid control softens, and a new harmony begins to emerge. You start to see that light cannot exist without shadow, and that your compassion deepens only because you have known suffering. This awareness dissolves the illusion of separateness between good and bad, between what you love about yourself and what you despise. You begin to understand that every human quality, even the ones society deems undesirable, holds a seed of truth when seen in the right context. The courage of a warrior and the gentleness of a healer are not opposites to be chosen between. They are partners within the same soul, each keeping the other from excess. In relationships, this integration reveals itself as empathy. Once you have accepted your own contradictions, it becomes impossible to judge others too harshly. You recognize in their flaws the same struggle that lives within you. This does not mean excusing harm or abandoning discernment, but understanding that every person is navigating their own dualities, often unconsciously. The more you integrate within yourself, the less reactive you become to the projections of others. Instead of seeking validation or superiority, you seek understanding. This inner equilibrium radiates outward, creating connections grounded in truth rather than performance. The integration of opposites also transforms our experience of time and change. When one is divided internally, every shift in life feels like a threat to stability. But when you have made peace with both rise and fall, gain and loss, you begin to move with life Ra,